Welcome everybody in the room and all those who are joining online as well. I'm delighted to welcome Jonas Radl to our seminar today. Jonas is an Associate Professor of Sociology at the Department of Social Sciences at the University of Carlos III in Madrid. And he's also a member of the Carlos III Juan March Institute of Social Sciences, Carlos III Institute of Economics, and the Global Young Academy. So his main areas of research are social stratification and life course. Jonas has also worked a lot on pensions and retirement, but here we're going to be looking at something rather different. He's also worked with me on immigration, so well known to each other, and always been a pleasure to work with. But the reason why he's here today in particular is because as a principal investigator of the research project Effort and Social Inequality, Advancing Measurement and Understanding Social Origin Effects, which is funded by a starting grant from the European Research Council. And he also leads a research group at Visit Bay in Berlin related to this. It's a big interdisciplinary project, and he's going to be talking about it today. It's also very well published across a full range of his works. And this will doubtless result in more outstanding publications, but I think it's quite new that he's presenting it to us, this paper, so it'd be really interesting to see where this work is at. So without more ado, I'll hand over to you, Jonas, to talk about more driven experimental evidence on differences in cognitive effort by social origin.
Well, thank you. Thanks a lot for these warm words, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. Yeah, it is an honor, and I'm very sorry I couldn't be there in person with you. I had the pleasure some years back to visit your department, to work with Lucinda, and so yeah, I don't feel like a total stranger, but yeah, obviously would have been nice as well. Anyway, yeah, so this is about these fresh results from the effort project, as Lucinda has mentioned, and yeah, it has been a longer term and collaborative endeavor. So you see a series of co-authors here. I'm especially pleased that two of them, William Foley and Melanie Swar, are with us as well here in the Zoom room. And yeah, so let's get started. So first, a bit about the conceptual background. So effort is very ubiquitous and also somewhat elusive concept, but I think everybody knows intuitively it refers to the mobilization of resources, of the act of trying hard, and it is widely understood to be crucial for achievement, right? To get anything done, you actually need to put your mind to it, or if it's physical work, I guess your body. And so there's lots of psychological, neuroscientific research, and also the social sciences have been interested in effort, and it's very relevant to big normative debates about equality of opportunity and meritocracy, right? There's the famous British dystopian novel by Michael Young, The Rise of Meritocracy, that popularized the term, and there obviously it was actually not such a nice idea that the society would be based on a formula for achievement purely vested on ability and effort. But as you know, nowadays it's actually a very bright image that many societies and many people in public discourse aspire to, right? So it's a positive image, and there's other related research on equality of opportunity, where very clearly effort is the only legitimate source of social inequality. So if we have to have some unequal distribution of resources in a society, from an ethical point of view, those should not be based on the circumstances that we happen to be born into or grow up with, but on the things that we can control, and that's by that Roma framework. That's only our effort. Okay. And yet, so this is a kind of a big topic, and has been addressed from various angles, but yet we don't really have a reliable empirical evidence on the distribution of cognitive effort in the population. We don't know who actually provides more effort and who less, and that is kind of relevant for these debates. And so our main contribution that we try to do in the overarching project and that I want to talk to you about today is to make effort observable. We hope to convince you that that we have a good strategy of identifying differences in cognitive effort by social background, and then we also try to explain those differences looking, for example, in different incentive conditions. Okay, so on this specific question of the social origins and how they relate to effort, right? There's these competing ideas about like who's actually more hardworking, and maybe the more conventional story we as sociologists also have been schooled in is this idea that you know, the working class is the hardworking part of the population. Obviously, working class occupation tended to be very routine, manually intensive, with very long schedules and very tough working conditions, and so there was this idea that yeah, working class kids would also be socialized into a kind of a blue-collar work ethic. And this would then contrast with the privileged social strata in an aristocratic or maybe early capitalist society, where actually the upper classes would demonstratively not give effort, right? So this is the Veblen hypothesis, obviously, that conspicuous leisure is part of the status symbol package that the privileged parts of the population would exhibit. And nowadays, the main narrative about this has changed. So I think most of us would maybe suspect that there's a positive association between social background, SES, and children's effort. And maybe the most prominent figure is Markowitz with this meritocracy trap idea, where, you know, nowadays the meritocrats, as he calls them, the privileged parts of today's societies, they actually need to earn this high status, and yeah, they even retrieve greater returns from it. Obviously, with all this polarization that we know is ongoing in income distributions, but so there's now a notion that the upper class actually work longer and you know, are very busy, and as opposed to that, there's this well-known notion of the culture of poverty, right? It's also a very racialized notion, but certainly a prominent idea in many discourses also about poverty, that actually the working or the lower social classes actually also lack the necessary motivation or the engagement to pull themselves out of their misery. And this is really backed up by previous research using observational data and self-reported personality traits, which is kind of the main tool that social scientists have used in the past to address cognitive effort. And there, so we find not very large, but, you know, significant correlations between parental background and so-called non-cognitive skills. This misnomer that economists use to refer to personality skills that are then having returns in the labor market and in other socioeconomic outcomes. And yeah, kind of looking through that literature, you see magnitudes of this SES gradient around 0.2, 0.25. Although there's a big range of what studies find, but this seems to be more or less where they're converging. Okay, so I've already mentioned a couple of times the measurement, right, as a kind of a crucial issue, and so let's take a moment to think about this problem of measuring effort. So oftentimes, if we think we want to measure effort, you could say, well, you give people a task and then we see how hard they try. But this cartoon, it's a classic in education, really exemplifies this dilemma, right? That you can't really design a task that is suited for everybody in the same way, because everybody has some abilities that may make them better suited to fulfill the task without actually giving great effort, and other people maybe don't have those abilities, and they may try very hard and don't get it done anyway. And then there's another problem, I call this the difference between saying and doing, and this is really trying to bring across a problem with these very pervasive self-reported personality scales, where there is also evidence showing that there can be biased and they're subject to different influences, also not totally stable as kind of the original theoretical foundation suggests. And particularly, I think when we think about it from an inequality or like a social stratification angle, it is very likely with what I had called the yuppie question on a recent slide, right? That the upper social classes would have maybe a stronger social desirability bias in their reporting of effort-related traits, right? So, am I a very hardworking person? Am I very busy? Am I trying to achieve things? And and maybe this is the way you think of yourself, but then there could be this gap between what our pictures of ourselves and then how we actually behave. So our strategy is staked on the use of 3 so-called real effort tasks. So this is what behavioral economists have called a task that is designed to be very simple and basically ability neutral. I mean, to the extent that that is possible. So the idea is we give people tasks that really don't require any special skill. They are not based on any math or maze solving or language graded skills. But in this case, as you see here on the left, we have the slider task. That is, you have to center as many of those little sliders like you would find in a media player, right? You have to put it exactly at 50, and the software will tell you where you are on the left to right scale. It goes from 0 to 100, and you need to center with the mouse as many as you can at 50. Okay, and the Simon task is one of the standard tasks in cognitive psychology, and it's also very simple. So there will be a sequence of arrows popping up on the screen, and every time you see an arrow that's pointing left, you got to press one button, and if it's pointing right, you got to press another button. And then the catch is that this arrow doesn't always show up on the same position. It sometimes shows up middle, left, or right, and you gotta ignore the position and focus just on the direction. So this is a task that kind of taps into attentional control or inhibition, because if you try to do it too fast and don't use the thinking fast register, as Kahneman called it, then you may commit mistakes. And then a bit similarly, the AX task is another task from neuroscience and cognitive psychology, where you would get a sequence of letters. It's always a pair, okay? And every time you see an A followed by an X, you press one button. And if you see any other sequence, you press another button. And so you gotta wait for this first cue, and then on the prompt on the second one, then give your answer. So it's we argue these are all very, very easy. You don't need any special skill. I mean, there may be some latent cognitive abilities that would influence, and we've listed those kind of what the psychologists call executive functions at the bottom that would be most central for these. But I mean, if you also try those out, I mean, it's really not hard. It's just over time it actually does tax your brain, and you need to stay focused. So that's the idea. And then we, as I mentioned at the beginning, also want to understand where the different kind of kids are maybe motivated by different kind of incentives. So we do this in the lab, so this is a bit artificial, but we can vary incentives experimentally. And so we have 3 different conditions. The first is the no incentive condition, where we only draw on intrinsic motivation. So we just tell them, okay, so do the task as good as you can. Or play a game. I'm coming to that in just a minute. Then we have the piece rate conditions. So these are material incentives. We tell the kids, okay, so now you can actually earn points for each time you give a correct response, and these points will be collected for you and accrued in account, and then at the end of the day you can convert all those points you collected into your selection of toys. So we have a menu with toys, and then they have like a prize, and they can kind of pick and choose from what they have earned. And then we have a final condition, which is the tournament condition. So there they still can earn those points. There's also the material incentives, but on top of that, we're now calling this a tournament, and then the whole school class, as you see now, it is organized in school classes. They compete for whoever is best at this particular task, and then the first 3 winners of the session would get a diploma and an applause. So here we add a status incentive. Okay, let me, if there's no question until this point, give you some brief impressions of how the fieldwork looked like. So this is a picture from Berlin. Yeah, I've mentioned this has been going on for a long time. So actually the pandemic hit in the middle. And yeah, so that entailed some issues. So this is a school-based sample where we collected data on 5th graders. So those are kids around the ages of 10 to 12. And so they were selected from a random sample of schools that were where the sampling frame was stratified by neighborhood income and school type in both Madrid and Berlin. In Madrid, where we started in 2019, the children came to visit the lab here on campus, and this would be part of a whole field trip that they did on the day. They would visit the campus, get a tour. We would also play some games with them, and yeah, have the kind of the 2 sessions, the experiment per se, and then the survey and IQ test session with them in between. And yeah, they had a really good time in that, and there was a nice way to also interest schools because it was combined with this university visit. In Berlin, we wanted to start the following school year, but then the pandemic hit, and we couldn't. We had to wait, and then we couldn't go through with our original plan to do it in the lab of the Technical University in Berlin, in the same way we did in Madrid, just for feasibility reasons with all the restrictions that applied in Germany at the time still. So what we had to do was to go into the school. So we created this mobile lab that you saw before, consisting of 13 laptops, and then we split the classes in 2, so we could do it in the actual rooms that they have there in the schools. And then we're doing the same thing, but in that slightly different environment. Okay, so let me maybe walk you quickly through the structure of these experiments. Okay, so we would start with some basic instructions, don't touch anything unless we tell you, and then so and so. And then there were these 3 tasks that I mentioned, right? You see them color coded here. So we always had the first like an explanation, which was pretty in depth, and then a practice round, and we would have manipulation checks. We would make sure that everybody has actually understood. They would try out, and if they failed, then we would come and then see whether they needed more explanation. And then they also could actually play 2 different games. So what is often called a leisure task in behavioral economics. We inserted that so that we reduce a bit the artificiality of the laboratory setting, that where in real life, we all know that there's, we have our plans to get stuff done, and then there's the distractions, right? And so there's an opportunity cost to engaging in effort. And this is really, pretty characteristic feature. And so we wanted them to have the possibility, since we didn't want to allow them to abandon the lab or the classroom. We offered them this opportunity to play one of 2 games, which they also tried out in this practice round. I don't know whether you see my mouse here, right? I'm here. And then we would start with the actual tasks, and this would be so this first 2 rounds. They would do the first task in the intrinsic condition, so without any explicit incentives for performance. And then they would do the same task again for 2 rounds, but now with the points. Then the energy rises in the room. They get very excited about that. And and then we move towards the second task, where they practice this, and then they do it again in the extrinsic and in the piece-based condition, and then the same for the third task. Yeah? Which task of the 3 was 1, 2, 3 was then buried according to the session, so that it's not a systematic order effect. And then at the very end we have this tournament. Okay, so then the very last task, they would do it again in the tournament session. So Unfortunately, we don't have like a full symmetry here across the 3 tasks. We get just for pragmatic reason, but we really want to have the central, the piece rate condition with the full range of tasks. Okay, so then our data in the end looks like this. So we have a full sample of over 1,000 students, and it's many more in Madrid than in Berlin. This was partly by design because we had Berlin kind of as a laggard in this case, but then also in Berlin, unfortunately, a bit more issues with missingness. Also, it was also more difficult to get all the planning observations because of a bit less parental consent. And so the main dependent variable is the task performance in these 3 tasks, the correct answers that they would be able to give in these 2-minute rounds, right? And then we would standardize then within tasks, with each task has like its own pace. And the models I'm going to show you kind of pool the 10 observation we would then get for each student together, and then put that in a hierarchical model where the lower level is the student round and the upper level is the student. And then obviously we control for which task it is. And then our main independent variables, so this about social background, are these 3. As good sociologists, we have collected all this data on education, on occupation. Is then coded for social, like salaried yes no, or as a continuous standardized ISEI measure. And then our crucial control is cognitive ability. So the students also completed a fluid intelligence Raven test, and then we have other controls and also psychological characteristics that I mentioned before. We have also collected those. Okay, let me show you some descriptive results first. So I told you, I hope this got clear, at the beginning of each round, the students could choose whether they would engage in the task or play a game. And then if yes, they could play, they could choose the game. It was a puzzle or a ball game. Pretty simple tasks, simple games, yeah. And as you can see here, I mean, so in the intrinsic condition here on the left side, around half, maybe a bit more than half of the kids in each of the rounds of the intrinsic condition would actually choose to play a game, and then only do the task in the other half of the rounds. But once we introduce the incentives, you see that then it's practically 100% of the kids that then engage with the task. We make it very, very clear that's their choosing, just that if they play the game, they don't earn points. Okay, so obviously that's an unpaid activity if they choose so. So yeah, maybe first question about the SES. Is this likelihood of choosing the game over the task dependent by SES? You see the 3 SES variables coded, right? So on the left we have tertiary education of the parents, and there's really no difference in between the taskers and the gamers. We have slight difference here by ISEI and by parental social class. So it does seem to be the case that the lower social class kids opted for the games slightly more often, but it's not a big chunk of the variation that we're seeing now here on this next graph. Now this is only looking at the gamers, okay? Sorry, only looking at the taskers, excluding the gamers, which is important for the intrinsic condition. And we see here that if you look at it, maybe first here by parental education, right? We see in the intrinsic condition the effort is is pretty low overall, and it is higher for the highly educated parents, the kids with highly educated parents, and then it goes up quite significantly in the piece rate condition, then stays there for a bit independently of the task, and then goes up again when we introduce the honor incentives. And that pattern we have more or less similar across the 3 SES indicators, maybe with slight differences, but yeah. So you see we have this, maybe the biggest gap seems like from these descriptive results, we have it in the intrinsic condition. It is even after excluding the gamers. Yeah, so it's not only that the lower SES kids maybe game a bit more, but also those that that don't game but task perform it at a lower level. But then then this gap seems to be narrowing, right? And when we look at that a bit more thoroughly in this further analysis, I told you we have these 3 different tasks, right? And so part of our design and what we try to convince you of, that is very useful to have 3 different tasks, because then we don't need to be concerned that there's like one particular unobserved ability that really impacts a lot, whether the certain kids are good on one of those tasks or not, even when we're controlling for IQ and other observables. So yeah, we wanted to have this this picture across the 3 tasks, and you see the SES gradient is positive throughout. Yeah, and the size of it depends a bit, but the general picture is the same. I mean, we can come back to this if somebody has a particularly interesting one of those tasks. And what it might mean. So now I move to multivariate results. So and we're focusing on our preferred specification that does control, obviously, for which task it was, for IQ, but also so we asked the kids for how familiar they are with the computer mouse, right? Because the slider task was done using a mouse, the other 2 with the keyboard. So we asked them that, and we also asked them how frequently they play video games. And that was that's another thing we want to control for, because it may kind of reflect then a certain familiarity with computerized applications at large. Okay, so this is now the parental SES effect by these different indicators. Okay, so in the colors you have the education, the occupational status, and social class. And on top of here we have the total SES effect on effort across the conditions. Okay, across the intrinsic, extrinsic, and tournament condition. And we see that is, yeah, as we already, so maybe from the descriptors, right, that is positive. It's around 0.2 standard deviations, and it's stronger for education than for especially well, I mean, obviously ISEI, it's a continuous measure, so it's a slightly different scale. But we do also see here, when we now focus on the difference between the conditions, right? So this takes the intrinsic as the baseline, and then looks at the interaction between these SES indicators and the incentives. And so we see that this advantage, right, of the high SES kids, that seems to shrink once we introduce incentives, either just material incentives or material and status incentives. It seems to shrink, but only significantly so if measured by tertiary education. Yeah, that's maybe a bit surprising that it's not more clear cut, this kind of picture across the different indicators. I'm curious what you think about that. I mean, just, yeah, not because we don't want to, maybe it's a lot to take in, but, you know, so we have this consequential decision at the beginning, and I don't know where all of you fall on this, but so you can kind of say, so we exclude the gamers, right, and we only focus on the people who do the tasks. Or we can also say, if you choose to play a game, that actually means you're providing zero effort, right? So we can kind of run the analysis in both ways, and it doesn't really matter a lot for the overall, what we call the average SES effect across incentives, right? That is very positive throughout. I mean, yeah, the magnitudes here seem smaller, but it's, I mean, it's now a slightly different distribution, especially for the intrinsic. But then what we see here is like the interactions, no, that I showed in the previous graphs in this lower part of the plot. That does really depend on how we treat those gamers, right? So the difference to the intrinsic condition is significant when we exclude the gamers, actually, and then look at what those that actually engage with the task, how well they do, if we measure it by education. And you know, these others one is just more scattered. So you also see here already the distinction between Berlin and Madrid, obviously. This we see here maybe a bit more on one side. So this is again, this is now only parents education, okay, where we saw the biggest effects overall. So let's see how the site where we did this, is it very sensitive to the context, institutional or structural, cultural, whatever we may think. And it does not seem to be the case, right? We have a very similar educational gradient overall in Madrid and Berlin. And yeah, also these coefficients look very similar, although yeah, we have this case here, since the Berlin sample is unfortunately smaller, we cannot state that this is yeah, there's more uncertainty with this estimate, as you see here. So this shrinking of the SES gap in the piece rate versus the intrinsic, yeah, maybe it's not as clear for Berlin, but then if you look at the tournament versus the no incentive condition, that is actually very much similar in the two countries. Okay. Now I'm sure, yeah, you were wondering about other controls that we might be interested in, and I was kind of picking on the personality traits. So yeah, it's very interesting to look at that, right? So here, the previous results here I showed you in this multivariate section were always this light blue, this turquoise ones, okay, where this is our preferred specification. I also show here the crude, just unadjusted differences. You see that's, yeah, it does matter, although yeah, and then these other controls, so the individual level controls, which include the personality, age, gender, they don't really matter a lot. And that's what we also found in some other more methodological research we did on our data, where we looked at this kind of this difference between saying and doing explicitly, the objective versus the subjective measures. And it seems like the personality measures are actually, at least among fifth graders, are not very well suited to predict their real effort in a laboratory setting. Okay, and this is now the same for ISCI instead of education, what we saw before. Okay, here, you know, the overall picture is the same, but as we saw already, the interactions here between SES and the incentive conditions are not significant for ISCI, and also not for parental class. Okay, although, yeah, the pattern's suggestive of like a similar trend of this gap narrowing, but yeah, we can't say with a lot of certainty here. Okay, just a final bit of evidence I wanted to show you is, so we for two of our tasks, right, the AX and the Simon task, the two psychological tasks, we can actually look a bit at what one might call task strategy. So because there we can distinguish between the reaction time and the accuracy, right? How fast students responded to the prompt, and how accurate they were in their responses. We can't do that obviously for the slider task, which is a different setup. But so yeah, so you can ask here for the education only. We did this now to not overwhelm you again, and that's where we had the biggest differences at face value. So you see the average reaction time goes down as we introduce incentives. That's what we would have expected, and yet, yeah, so the SES gradient here, I mean, yeah, it seems to maybe slightly narrow here, I guess, but it's not a very clear picture. Here, this is now the error rate, right? So there would be the other piece of the story, like you know, the accuracies of those tasks, since they were so simple, right? By design, they were very high, like over 90% for both of those, or like, yeah, for one of them over 90, or the other one close to 90%. And so here we see this gap being closed with added incentives, seems to be driven partly by lower SES kids committing fewer mistakes, right? We saw that they were not faster, right? They were not relatively faster to the high SES kids, right? They were just kind of increasing the pace at the same rate, more or less. But they apparently, as they try harder, they avoid more mistakes, and thus really come come to close that gap here in the tournament. Okay, so let me conclude based on those findings. Overall, we saw that effort is positively associated with parental social background that aligns with, let's say, the contemporary dominant narratives about effort. We saw that parental education is more strongly associated with cognitive effort than the occupation-based SES indicators. Yeah, something to mull over. And then we saw that especially this parental education gradient is largest in the intrinsic condition, but this effort edge of the privileged children becomes then smaller once once material and also status incentives are being introduced. We can say overall that the magnitude of these gradients that we showed you are, well, it's positive effects, but the magnitudes are actually smaller than what we saw in these psychological studies, or yeah, also economist studies that are based on self-reported personality traits. So that tries to, I think that speaks to this possible social desirability or other reference group biases, other things that may come into play that may distort a bit the picture and may make this difference kind of in hardworking nature between different social groups maybe appear larger than it is according to this maybe more robust way of measuring cognitive effort. So yeah, maybe for discussion, obviously all your questions are very welcome, but very interesting to thinking about like what motivates these high SES children to especially exert more effort when the task is unrewarded, right? Are they more rule following, more trusting in authority? And yeah, looked at it from the other point of view, from the poorer kids, would they benefit from more immediate incentives? That was kind of part of the initial hypothesis when I designed this project. Could it be that clearer incentives and for instance, if you would more clearly communicate returns to education, returns to non-cognitive skills, to underprivileged social group, would that help their effort exertion? That would be, let's say, the Heckman style reading of those results. Just very briefly to look ahead, so we try to do something about the missingness that we're dealing with. I mentioned it especially with respect to Berlin. So we got kind of almost 200 subjects that we can maybe try to draw in here when we do some multiple imputation. And then what would be very useful to further validate this objective effort measure and really drive home this point that it's superior in validity to measuring cognitive effort. Want to look at other also physiological measures. So we have another part, like a smaller sample, obviously, of subjects who did the same experiments with pupillometry and also with heart rate measures. And then we can look at other kind of effort proxies like self-reported effort, teacher-reported effort, and that kind of thing. And then like I think a big intriguing piece that we haven't gotten around to, but that may wind up being part of this paper about the social origins of effort, would then look specifically at the intergenerational transmission. So we saw like, okay, so there's this positive gradient. Is that because the high SES parents are also hardworking now when they're in middle-aged, and they directly transmit that, or more successfully transmit that to their kids? What's the mechanism? And yeah, so when we can exploit some of the dyadic data that we also have been collecting with online experiments among some of the parents of the same kids, we'll be able to then say something about that. But yeah, for the moment, I hope this was interesting, and I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. So we have, I think we've got everybody online as well as who have joined us now. So opportunity to ask some questions, follow up on some maybe some points at the end.
Yeah.
So
I have a very quick one. What made you choose fifth graders specifically? Was it something about the stage of cognitive development?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. It was a pretty pragmatic process, to be honest. So I wanted to get them as early as possible, so that the social origins effects would be as immediate as possible, and less, let's say, conditioned by some of the experience that children make in their lives, right? So I mean, obviously, the longer educational careers last, the more success and failure children would experience, and this may have then either motivating or frustrating effects on their effort levels. So ideally we wanted to look at them early enough, but then we wanted to also be able to ask them questions and things like that. So they should have also be able to sit still through like a 2-hour lab session and then respond to a survey. And then together with some institutional features, we arrived at that as the adequate age. Just before adolescence. I think that's useful in terms of the development, to more specifically answer your question. But yeah, and then many of the like basic cognitive abilities, like, you know, these executive functions, they would be well developed by then.
So I'm done.
Thank you so much. It's really fascinating, really interesting. I was going to ask you about your last point. What is it about parents that, so, you know, I believe your story, but that having to do with parental education, but I wanted to, you know a bit more about what is it that parents do. So we know that high educated parents spend more on their kids. Is it the time, or is it the role modeling, as you were saying? So if you can expand maybe a little bit on that, I'm very curious about that. And also about gender differences, whether you found anything at all.
Yes, thank you for these questions. So we, as I mentioned, we haven't really gotten around to do the thorough deep dive on this on the parenting, but we did collect data on parenting style, parental involvement, also on like private tutoring, shadow education, and maybe William wants to say a few words of that, because he has I think just recently looked into the parenting styles. Do you want to maybe briefly say what the provisional results were?
Sure. Hi everyone. I mean, this was very provisional, but basically it seems that we looked at parenting styles in terms of a 2x2 kind of thing, in terms of how much warmth the child reported the parent showed towards them. I believe that's correct, right, Jonas? And how much control the parent influenced. So it ended up being kind of 2 binary variables, so 4 different scenarios. So we had authoritative styles, which basically means that the parents exerted a lot of control, but they also were warm. We had authoritarian styles where the parents weren't warm but controlling. Permissive, where they weren't controlling but they were warm, and uninvolved, where they were neither warm nor controlling. And provisionally, it seems firstly that overall permissive parenting, so the ones that are warm but not controlling, seems to be the worst for effort. I'm not sure why. Maybe because, you know, the child is always being told that they're doing great, and maybe not getting enough of the proverbial stick, so to speak. There also may be an interesting interaction potentially with SES, in a sense that certainly for mothers, it does seem that an authoritarian parenting style for low SES can actually be beneficial, but vice versa for high SES, it's negative. So for high SES, the effect of having an authoritarian parent seemingly is negative. And these effects are really more pronounced or significant really only for the mothers. That may partly, I think, be a result of maybe a bit more missingness with the fathers, and may also be a more substantive reason. Maybe mothers just have more influence over particularly younger children.
So that's just this standard Baumrind typology. And yeah, about the gender question, we have a separate paper where we look at gender, and yeah, there is actually a quite consistent difference, and it is that boys provide more effort than girls when materially incentivized. And so in this intrinsic condition, there's no real gender difference, but then this really opens up once we introduce the toy rewards. Then the boys really outwork the girls. I'm sad to report, and then yet so there's this very strong notion in behavioral economics and that kind of gender literature, where there's supposed to be a strong competitive drive among the boys, especially. So we were very interested then in the contrast between the piece rate and the tournament, and that is not actually then further amplifying boys' advantage as that kind of strand of research would have suggested, but it seems to largely remain stable, and in parts, let's say, if you look at subsections of the data, maybe the girls even seem to be cutting down on a part of that advantage. So that's, I guess, in a nutshell, the gender results.
Thank you. Well, so does anybody on screen want to put up your hand too? No, so Jennifer now.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm here from psychology, and really appreciated seeing this data. It's an amazing project. So thank you for doing it. You will have to convince me a bit though about the interpretation of the task as a measure of effort. But I don't just mean that as a criticism. I mean, I do think these are measures of executive functioning, unless there's some specific component that you're getting at. What we would normally use to measure effort is things like persistence on an almost impossible task, like anagram completion. I just wondered if you consider those instead. That said, though, I do think that some of what's actually might be underlying some SES differences in executive functioning performance links to effort that might be playing out in non-conscious ways, the product of some kind of adaptive calculus that your cognitive resources are going through in terms of what is relevant for someone in the moment and opportunity costs. And there's some interesting literature on what might be going on there. In my lab, we've been playing around with this too. For example, could you not just change incentives, which is obviously a really good way to go, but also the framing of the task, how it's presented. There's some other work from Ethan Young, for example, looking at how if you make the same task more ecologically valid and real, kind of linked to people's lives as opposed to abstract. So yeah, that's the way we're going, trying to understand the mechanism. Just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Great points. And yeah, I'm afraid I'm not familiar with all the references you mentioned. I mean, let's say the general notion why we decided against some of these more demanding settings was that since we're very interested in the individual differences in effort, right? So we want to be able to compare the effort of kids from different social origins and with different ability sets, right? So I think there's just a big risk if you have a task and then you make it, as you were saying, you make it impossible to solve, for instance. Yeah, it's very hard, and you know, so I'm not. I guess I would be hesitant to purchase into that when you then want to tell me that, okay, so then the poor kids, they give up, so it's just because they don't want to try, right? So I think it's that is a bit this dilemma that I mentioned. You want to kind of take the ability out, but if you if then it's really it's getting a bit also into the question of like I guess external validity and that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a perfect design overall. I think ours is better than previous ones in being able to abstract from like very specific abilities that may come into play with one specific task, and then we have just better external validity in having pretty representative samples, right? These are in entire school classes, kind of on schools, kind of really from a wide range of neighborhoods and in socioeconomic conditions. So yeah, that's what we try to do. And then, I mean, I mentioned we control for IQ. I mean, that is kind of from the, let's say, from the sociological or the economic point of view. I guess, yeah, once you take out that standard measure of ability, we should be left with pretty much effort. But I'm thankful for your points, and we've taken note. So I may come back to those. Thank you.
Yes, I've got a quick question. I was just coming from my office to this room, so you might actually answer this at your first. But it was the point you made about intergenerational transmission of effort. And I was just wondering what mechanism you're proposing for that.
Yeah, I mean, that would be through socialization, right? On the one hand, right? So parents priming kids or incentivizing them through everyday practice and the way they explain the world to them, what is good and bad, and then obviously also through setting examples, right? And so this is the part that I mentioned we didn't get to yet, but we're very looking forward to be able to look at this dyadic data and then really compare how well did the parents do on the same tasks, depending on their SES and so on, and how closely does that match then their children's relative effort? Does that respond to the question?
Fine. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
So do we have so Burkhard waving a hand, is that right? Yes. And we've got another question coming up. So Burkhard first, yeah.
Well, Jonas, thank you so much. Great talk, great project. It's good to see you. My question is very simple about fifth grades. I want to go back to this issue. I understand your logic why you want to choose the fifth grade, but I'm not sure about whether you have looked at the range of age differences within the fifth grade and what did you do about it. So if I understand right, they cover ages between 10 to 11. Is it an 18 months age difference within the sample that and did you calculate the amount of effort change within that 18 months age difference so that we can think about these things as malleable or are they fixed characteristics that we learn something from this association on that age? Thank you.
Yeah, you really speak to my heart there. I mean, so this is exactly right. So I mean, the range is actually bigger. I think we got some 9-year-old and some 12-year-old, right? There's I guess, especially in Germany, there can be some green shirting, and then there's a lot of repetition in Spain, and then we got immigrants maybe coming and being placed in certain guys. So it's not, but yeah. So the most of the kids, and then depends on we did those experiments throughout the year, mostly in autumn and spring. Then obviously it depends when we have the test. So in the analysis I showed you, we just control for age on a monthly basis, and that I think should. Maybe I should have mentioned that specifically also, because it's kind of controlling for developmental issues that may also be relevant for task performance, and should not be correlated with SES, but may happen to be so. So in that sense, and then I'm glad to report that we started a paper on the month of birth difference, actually. So as you know, there's this relative age effect literature in economics especially, and then together with my colleague from UNED here from Madrid, Manuel Valdez, we've worked on the paper that looks at that relative age difference and then tries to really tease that apart. And then it's a very positive effect. So yes, so the older kids in the class provide more effort, and after controlling for their IQ and for learning disabilities as well, which in the Spanish sample we have measured very well. And so yeah, and that survives it, and it's about the two-fifths of the standard deviation difference for one year in relative age, which it's called relative. We can't fully separate, let's say, the relational from the absolute component of the relative age effect, what it's called. because we don't have enough range in, I mean, yeah, we did have different test dates, but unfortunately, because of the pandemic, like it hit us in March, so we finished there. We couldn't kind of get up to the summer, and then gladly, like this past spring, we finally finished with the data collection. So yeah, it just happened to be we don't have a lot of spread, and so we tried, but there's just not enough variation there to tell you, let's say, the true causal effect of being younger just for being younger and not for being less developed. Thanks, Becca.
So we have another, sorry, my eyesight isn't very good, but we have another question from the people in online. So if you want to ask your question.
Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah, so it's Abigail. So my question is about to what extent the nutrition prior to the tasks was considered. So particularly about the kind of potential impact and the relationship between good nutrition and cognitive function and effort possibilities, and the effect that might have in terms of the socioeconomic distribution. I'm not quite sure of the arrangements in Madrid and Berlin, but certainly here we're seeing that children arriving at school without breakfast and then may or may not engage with a lunchtime food offer as well is having an impact on the learning outcomes. And I wondered whether you thought that might have an impact on your findings and how you might control for that.
Yeah, thank you. There you got me. So we didn't collect any data on that, and I'm sure what you say is true also in Spain, at least to some extent. I mean, in the public school system, the normal thing is that all the kids eat lunch there, and the kids that can't afford the copay, they have kind of state-funded stipends for that. But yeah, I mean, what you're saying about breakfast is true. I mean, like in our sessions here, you know, they do like a breakfast break and so on, but they do it actually. They did it after the experimental session, which was the first thing they did when they arrived here. So I guess that is something we can't exclude, this possibility. Thanks for drawing on my attention to it.
Have any so that means I could get cards and ask some questions. So I had two. One I probably know the answer to, but I'm going to ask it anyways. So Madrid and Berlin, was this purely pragmatic, or was there things that you expected to be different or similar about the two settings? So that's my first question. And the second one is a bit vaguer, but I was thinking about this relationship between effort and cognitive ability. And as you were saying, you know, you can't, it's hard to separate out the two in many measures, but whether this is also, whether there's something also going on in terms of it might be possibly about the expectations of those who have different levels of cognitive ability for the benefits of a high effort task or for putting in more effort. And so to put it more simply, did you test for an interaction between SES and cognitive ability? And do you think that would be a sensible thing to do, or do you think that's not a sensible thing to do?
Thank you, Lucinda. So the first question, I mean, yeah, it's I won't lie to you. There were pragmatic reasons that made that contrast very good in terms of viability, but I think it works very well from an institutionalist perspective, because Germany is known as this very highly stratified education system, and Spain is the contrary, right? It's a very comprehensive, with no tracking system. There's a difference between private and public schools, which we took into account in our sampling. But yeah, so that's why ex ante I expected to find larger SES differences in Germany as opposed to Spain. And yeah, I mean, I didn't really show you the whole breakdown of, like, if you do it by SES and by ICI, by in class. I only showed it to you for education. So I mean, there are slight differences, but the overall picture doesn't change. Not like there's suddenly a negative effect if you in one of the places according to what measure you use. So yeah, so that at least didn't seem to fully pan out. It seems like in Berlin, if anything, like maybe the intrinsic effort edge of the higher SES kids seems to be a bit more pronounced than in Spain, but nothing that we could really ascertain so far. So I guess that expectation didn't really pan out. I mean, this is just for clarity. So we did in Berlin, right, which is a kind of an odd land in Germany, and like most, as you probably most of you know, in most of Germany, after fourth graders, they already apply the ability tracking and then send kids to different secondary schools. Berlin and all the Eastern Länder, they don't do that. They do it after sixth grade. So in our case, these kids were still all together in kind of their usual setting. There are like a few kind of early gymnasiums, there where some kids would already send to one of those higher track schools after fourth grade, so they were not there anymore. So we made sure we had at least one of those schools as well in our sample. So we have one early gymnasium as well. I think we had like 2 or 3 classes of that, and so unfortunately, or I don't know. I mean, it's not so clear, that story what it tells us about these. You can say, okay, so it's also good because it's very robust. That finding doesn't seem to be strongly dependent on context, but maybe it could have been nice to have some more story to tell. And as I said, we will still dig deeper into different parts of the data, and maybe something more conclusive comes out of it in terms of this international comparison. But obviously it would be ideal to do this in a large country comparison and then have an actual explicit test of what moderators at the context level would do, right? But this goes without saying, but this wasn't feasible for this project. And then on your second question, that's a very good point. And I mean, I know we talked about it at some point, and I think I have heard that suggestion in the past, and I think it's a good one. I don't think we have systematically implemented it. I think we played around, and maybe there wasn't much there with this ability SES interaction. But I think it would be useful, and as you were saying, also to think about more clearly what would be the theoretical expectation for that, and then maybe test that in more rigorous ways. So thank you. We put that on the list of things that we certainly should look more at in these next steps.
So are there any other people get questions?
Okay, I'll ask one. I was wondering how you link this with literature on kind of work intensity and work effort, and if you're making any kind of statements about how does this translate in terms of labour market behaviour and work, because a lot of social attitudes to work effort by class, I think, are to do with paid employment. That's my guess. You might challenge me on that, but people tend to think that certain classes engage in the labour market in a different way. And I think probably one of the issues, and there's nothing you can do about this, is that if you're analysing this in an experimental context, we simply don't know what these children will go on to do in the labour market. They might work more hours if they're from lower socioeconomic groups. They might have more work intensity in certain jobs if they're from lower groups. And it's how do you kind of square that circle and go from experimental to that and navigate that challenge there?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, so thank you for these thoughts, and I think that is, ultimately maybe the hardest test, right, of like this non-cognitive skills literature, like how large are these returns to effort in terms of wages. I mean, you can obviously argue that already if it's relevant for educational entertainment, that even though then maybe there's no net effect on like labor market outcomes, that would be relevant in its own right. But that would be interesting, and I may or may not be looking at that in a future project. Exactly what you were saying there, to look like maybe more longitudinally, and then again with more observational data. But I find it really interesting what you were saying. I mean, we did there's one paper that came out of the thesis of Alberto Palacios Abad, the PhD student who did his thesis within the project, and he defended this in September. And so in his last paper where he uses our data, there we find that there's so we look at the effect of effort on school grades, right? So they're kind of flipped around, right? So the effort is there, not the dependent, but the independent variable, and we look at it in terms of how strongly does it predict grades, and we compare it actually to the effort that were reported by the teacher for each student. And what we find is that this association is very significant, and the magnitude of that effect is pretty large. It's as large as the effect of parental background and of IQ, more or less. Yeah, so it's at that ballpark. And but what is even bigger is the effect of teacher perceived effort. So if the teacher thinks you're hardworking, that is even more relevant for the way he or she or other teachers actually would then grade you. So that is the only direct way we did already look at this effort achievement link. But I totally agree with you that it would be very worthwhile to kind of to bring this paradigm of using real effort behavioral measures to the this literature that's dominated by those self-reported traits. And I mean, maybe let me take the opportunity to more thoroughly answer a previous question. I don't remember who asked it, but that was kind of also I think the part of the subtext was, is effort really a personality trait? Is it stable, right? And that would be related, right, to your question. Would it still then, okay, for instance, in 5th grade, we observe it, and then when they're adults, you know, would we still find that? I mean, I did, yeah, for Spain, we will be able actually, you know, the data protection will allow us to go back to these kids in 10 years time, and then we can see like a marshmallow test style investigation if you know, if we can find enough of those kids again. But for now, what I want to say more conceptually is, so I don't see effort as like a real, you know, I don't say it's just another personality trait. I think personality traits, and there's obviously a lot of established research on that, so I don't think it should be considered, you know, another trait. And it obviously would be, it lies really, you know, there's many established scales that are relevant, right? Conscientiousness, locus of control, need for cognition, you know, self-efficacy. There's so many that kind of touch on some issue that would then be relevant for effort. So I see it more as a behavior where we would also expect some stability across time in subjects, but and that should then be hopefully possible to explain in terms of personality traits, but also totally possible that it depends a lot on the situation and on life stages and on, as we showed here, in incentives, right? So yeah, I see it as something in between, right? It's something that is a real behavior that probably shows up in consistent ways, but I at this stage we don't have information to claim that, you know, your effort as a 5th grader will still be your effort as an adult. But that will be an empirical question to see the long run stability. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Well, I think we've exhausted the questions here. So and we've
great questions.
On them. So did somebody say something? No. So just remains to thank you very much for the fascinating talk and very interesting discussion afterwards. Great to have you with us.
Thank you so much. These were great questions. Thank you. We really took note and we'll discuss, and was a pleasure to be here. Thanks.